Okay, this will be a quick little video about this article right here, which is entitled The Reason JFK Jr. Was Murdered. And obviously, that's a very intriguing title. And I just wanted to kind of put this together because this article ties into two videos I recently did, the one on the Gemstone File, and then also the one on the bizarre disappearance of Howard Hughes. The things talked about in this article kind of tie in with the things I talked about in those two videos. So I just wanted to whip something up here real quick. And so, if you're not familiar with, first of all, the Gemstone File, it was a document from like the mid 1970s or so. It was written by a guy who supposedly was super connected to a group of very rich, very powerful people who ran the world. And this guy wrote this document. This told the true story of the JFK assassination, of the Robert Kennedy assassination, Watergate, a whole bunch of things we're covering. And this guy who wrote it, his name was Bruce Roberts, claimed that because he was connected to this group of rich, powerful people, he knew the true stories of those. And he told the true stories of those events in the Gemstone File. It's a great read. And this video I did on the Gemstone File is one of my favorites. So that's interesting. And this article that we're going to talk about kind of ties in with the Gemstone File. And how it ties in is that what this article claims is that JFK Jr. had come into possession of the Gemstone File, the actual document, and a few other documents because he was secretly investigating his father's murder from decades earlier. And he was preparing to publish the Gemstone File and publish a whole bunch of other different articles, like research materials, in an issue of his magazine. He, in the mid 2000, or excuse me, the mid 1990s, he started up a magazine called George Magazine. Bit of an intriguing title, and we'll get into that in a bit. But he started up this magazine called George Magazine that kind of focused on politics. And so, kind of what this article that we'll talk about here covers is that he was secretly conducting like a really in-depth investigation into his father's death, and he was getting ready to basically shock the world and publish it in this George magazine. And then he died in a plane wreck before it could happen. And so, what this article that we'll talk about consists of is basically just a kind of like an email exchange between a couple people. This guy, John Hankey, he has created a number of documentary films about the JFK assassination, and he's a pretty well known researcher into the JFK assassination. And he claims he was contacted by this guy. His name is True Ott. And he's, a real person. He's written a couple of books. He's given interviews. He used to be heavily involved in the Mormon church, and then he walked away. That's kind of significant, and we'll talk about that. And so this guy reached out to John Hankey and claimed that he had some pretty explosive information about the JFK assassination and JFK Jr.'s death. And so they kind of started exchanging info and talking about it over email. And then this John Hankey guy just, published it as an article, and it's from about 20 years ago. So the article's been around for a while, but we'll go ahead and get into this article. It starts out with this guy, True Ott, kind of talking a bit about how he got involved in this. So he says the Las Vegas files are examined. That's what this part is titled. In 1995, I was going through my safe and file cabinets and came across the sealed manila envelope that had been placed in my trust by my financial planning client a decade earlier. I had completely forgotten about it. I called his home to see what he wanted me to do with it, and his wife informed me that Mr. C had suffered a stroke a year earlier and he was confined to a nursing home. He was in his 70s now and was not doing very well. In short, she didn't know anything about the file and suggested I could just dispose of it. I tossed it into the trash bin, but I thought that I should at least see what all the fuss was about. In many ways, I wish I had never opened it. It was a true Pandora's box, and I was shocked to read its contents. It was file number 5 of a group of 7 files called the Gemstone Files. I don't know what the other 6 files contained, but this one was a literal ballbuster. It was the full story of the CIA planned and executed contract hit of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States. It was full of very complete specifics, including such things as photostats of canceled checks, travel vouchers, orders on CIA letterhead, personnel lists of participants, disposition of witnesses and evidence, etc. The problem was, I recognized the name of many of the men who participated in this assassination, as well as the massive cover up that followed. And really, the main thing that jumped out at me when I read this article, and the main reason I kind of wanted to put this little video together, was this sentence right here, which says the document that this Truott guy found in his financial planning client's safe was file number 5 of a group of 7 files called the Gemstone Files. And as I mentioned, made one pretty long video kind of going into depth on the Gemstone file and everything that it covers. A lot of people have called it the greatest conspiracy theory ever. It is so fascinating, one of my absolute favorite topics. And it, again, as I mentioned, kind of tells what it purports to be the true story of all these massive events from like the mid 20th century, everything from the disappearance of Howard Hughes, a whole bunch of high profile assassinations. I mean, there's just so much explosive information packed into this Gemstone file. And the one of the main kind of mysteries of not only the Gemstone file, but also the disappearance of Howard Hughes, which is very heavily covered in the Gemstone file. And that's that when Howard Hughes, basically vanished off the face of the earth, there was this really mysterious group of men who called themselves the Mormon Mafia. And they moved in and basically controlled Howard Hughes's empire. At the time, Howard Hughes was probably the richest person in the world, or at least one of them. He had an absolutely massive empire, had a ton of power. And then he just vanished off the earth one day, and nobody saw him for the next 20 years. And this group, who no one really knew anything about, but they were dubbed the Mormon Mafia because they were all Mormons. They moved in, and there's just a lot of intrigue and mystery surrounding them. And it's interesting to kind of tie this into this article we're talking about, because this guy, Truott, who's writing this, used to be involved in the Mormon church, and he lives in Utah. And he claimed that he got this Gemstone file document from the safe of his financial planning client in Utah. So there is kind of a connection to this Mormon mafia with this article. And we'll go ahead and continue on with Truott talking a bit more about this mysterious file that he discovered in his financial planning client's safe. So he says, these were not all Jewish organized crime bosses. Some men were linked to my LDS Church, Latter-day Saints Church, authorities, and some were nationally prominent politicians in my beloved Republican Party. The file was extremely damning towards George H.W. Bush, who in 1963 was the CIA head in Dallas. The obvious involvement of the FBI and Dallas PD and their subsequent squelching of information, as outlined in the file, made me physically sick. There was no person in federal law enforcement that I could trust with this information, that is, if it was indeed legitimate. At first, I refused to believe that it could be legitimate at all. My paradigm of perception refused to believe it could possibly be factual. However, I could not understand why my client would have such a file, and why he would want it sent to Beverly Hills, California, as well as a notice sent to Hank Greenspun of the Las Vegas Sun newspaper if my client happened to die suspiciously. Like I said, it was a definite Pandora's box, one that I soon realized was too big for me. I kept thinking I ought to shred its contents, but I couldn't bring myself to do so. So again, the one kind of sentence here that really intrigued me about this article was this right here, that if something should happen to this man, this client of Truott's, he wanted a notice sent to Hank Greenspun is actually his name. He wanted a notice sent to Hank Greenspun of the Las Vegas Sun newspaper if this guy happened to die suspiciously. And this Hank Greenspun, we'll talk about him for a bit because he's a very fascinating character. I'm very convinced that he is way, 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 way more powerful and influential in the history of our country than people realize. And so he was the owner and publisher of the Las Vegas Sun, which was one of the biggest newspapers in Las Vegas at the time. And anytime you see him like mentioned or referenced in an article, they always kind of reference him as the publisher of the Las Vegas Sun. But there is much, much more to his story, because before he owned the Las Vegas Sun, he got caught supplying weapons to Israel. He was basically an international arms dealer, and he got caught smuggling weapons from the United States through Mexico to Israel. And it was like heavy duty stuff like machine guns and airplane parts. And he was arrested for this and got a fine and kind of got a slap on the wrist. And then he was pardoned by JFK in 1961. So it was very shortly after JFK was inaugurated that he pardoned Hank Greenspun almost immediately. And so you kind of have to think maybe Hank Greenspun might have called in a few favors to get this done, but at any rate, he was pardoned and he used the money he made from smuggling weapons to Israel to buy the Las Vegas Sun, and he turned it into one of the most successful papers in Las Vegas. And the reason the Las Vegas Sun and Hank Greenspun is important in the Howard Hughes story is that in the late 1960s, Howard Hughes moved to Las Vegas and he started just buying up basically the whole city. He just started buying up every casino, buying things up left and right. And it was really strange and kind of out of the blue because he'd never owned casinos before or anything like that. So he just kind of randomly moved to Las Vegas, started buying up all these casinos. And by the way, by this point, Howard Hughes had not been seen in public for about 15 years. He just had vanished off the face of the earth. No one had seen him. Most people believe he was probably either dead or kidnapped by this point. But the point is, Howard Hughes, quote unquote, moved to Las Vegas and he had this massive empire that was just printing money. And so he used a lot of that money to just buy up Las Vegas. And this was the point in Howard Hughes's life where he was, controlled by this Mormon mafia. This Mormon mafia had moved in and was essentially just controlling this massive, massive Howard Hughes empire. And the reason this kind of ties into Hank Greenspun is that after Howard Hughes had moved to Las Vegas, that was when this whole narrative that Howard Hughes was crazy and totally eccentric and had just become this basically a total lunatic. That's when this whole narrative that Howard Hughes was crazy started. Before he moved to Las Vegas, that narrative didn't exist at all. He was always referred to as either being like bashful or hibernating or shy, or he didn't like the press. And it wasn't until he moved to Las Vegas that this whole narrative that he was crazy and, was growing out his fingernails and had this long bushy beard, it was when he moved to Las Vegas was when this narrative happened. This narrative took hold, and it was the reporting in the Las Vegas Sun and Hank Greenspun reporting that kind of originated and started this whole notion that Howard Hughes was crazy and eccentric and this total hermit. Even like this book on the left there, The Bashful Billionaire, that was published in 1967, and it was a biography of Howard Hughes, and it didn't mention anything at all about him being crazy. And by that point in 1967, he'd been missing for over 10 years. He hadn't been seen in public in over 10 years. And when he moved to Las Vegas, Howard Hughes, quote unquote, moved into this moved into this casino named the Desert Inn, and no one again ever saw him. And the Las Vegas Sun had all these reports about how he was so crazy. And one interesting thing that did happen, and I talked about this in the Howard Hughes video, but 60 Minutes did a really extensive piece on Howard Hughes in Las Vegas, and it's really good. And it was entitled "One of Our Billionaires is Missing," and it was about this whole strange mystery about what had happened to Howard Hughes and what was going on with his empire. And Hank Greenspun, our guy, was heavily, heavily featured in this 60 Minutes piece. And he talked so much about just how crazy and all these weird stories about Howard Hughes. He kind of became regarded as like the expert on Howard Hughes almost. And one really fascinating thing that happened right around this time was that Hank Greenspun got caught up in the Watergate hearings. And so what happened here was that there was a burglary attempt at Hank Greenspun's Las Vegas Sun office, and someone or a group of people actually tried to get into his safe in his office. And the thought was that the same team that had pulled off the Watergate break in was also behind this break in at Hank Greenspun's office because they thought that he had blackmail material on certain Democratic presidential candidates. And so this team who who performed the Watergate break-ins, the thinking was that this same team also tried to break into Hank Greenspun's office and safe. And so Hank Greenspun was called out to Washington, D.C. to testify in the Watergate hearings. And it was very interesting what he said, because he said, no, 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 it was not the blackmail file on these Democratic presidential candidates that they were after. What these people who broke into my office were after was my Howard Hughes file. And it's never really been determined what exactly this Howard Hughes file was, or what it in, contained, or anything like that. But Hank Greenspun did have this quote that I highlighted here. And he said, I'll go to the can for life rather than surrender those documents. And so, whatever this Howard Hughes file was clearly very, very important. And it is the kind of the point is that Hank Greenspun had a lot of like blackmail material, and he knew a lot of secrets. Now, this guy was so plugged in to the Las Vegas scene. The more you kind of look into him, the more it really seems like he was just heavily, heavily, heavily into blackmailing other people. And so the fact that he just happens to be mentioned in this note that or in this with these documents that Truott found, that Hank Greenspun just happens to be mentioned, is very, very interesting to me. So anyway, we'll continue on here. So this is the part where John Kennedy Jr. gets involved. This is Truott talking more about his involvement in this. And so he says, during the summer of 1998, I was actively involved in protesting the expansion of Circle 4 Farms' gigantic hog factory into Iron County. My grassroots citizens initiative had received a bit of national notoriety, with a number of AP Wire stories circulating the nation. One such story caught the eye of a publication called George Magazine. The editor and staff contacted me and scheduled an appointment to meet and review my story. So again, George Magazine was the magazine that JFK Jr. founded and published in the mid 1990s. And then what Truott said in that little section is true. There were a number of articles about this gigantic hog farm. I think it was going to be the biggest hog farm in the nation. There was a citizens group that was led by Truott protesting the expansion of this hog farm for environmental reasons. And there were a lot of articles about this circulated throughout the nation via the Associated Press. And then Truott continues on and he says, the editor of George Magazine flew into Cedar City in his private plane to meet me and shoot a photo spread. We spent the entire day, a Saturday, together. At the end of the day, at a local steakhouse, we sat down for a concluding meal. Over salad, I had to confess to the editor that I'd never even heard of, much less read a copy of George Magazine until he had called me. He reached into his briefcase and produced a copy. Looking at it, I was surprised to see that it was owned and founded by John Kennedy Jr. I asked him about John and his politics. I was told that John was a real champion of the underdog, and that's why they were producing the story on his Truott's organization. I commented, I believe my image of John is like most Americans, the enduring image of little John courageously stepping forward and giving his best salute as the Cashin carrying his father's body slowly rolled by. Tell me, does John accept the official Warren Commission account of the assassination, or does he think there was more to it? At this late date, does it even matter? The editor nodded and said, of course, he doesn't accept the Warren Commission, but there is not a lot he or anyone else can do about it. And I guarantee you it does indeed matter, at least to him. It is one of his major goals in life to find out the truth. I replied, has he ever heard of something called the Gemstone Files? With that, the air became electrified. The editor laid down his salad fork and said, what do you know about the gemstone? Oh, it just might be that I have a copy of file number 5. Does that interest you? I casually volunteered. You can't be serious. Are you serious? Don't kid about something like that. Where did you get it? He almost screamed. The dinner was immediately over, even though our steaks were just coming from the kitchen. We had them placed into containers to take them with us. The editor had to see the infamous gemstone immediately. He couldn't wait until the meal was finished. It was laid on a Saturday night in Cedar City, Utah. I handed him the file and he offered to compensate me for it. I refused. I asked of only one thing in return, if the information proved to be genuine that I just needed to know. I just wanted justice to be served and the guilty parties prosecuted. I was awakened the next morning at 5 a.m. John's editor explained that he had been up all night reading the file. He had called John directly and he was told to fly it immediately back to John. John had again offered to compensate me up to $10,000 for the lead. He felt it was that good. I politely refused and gently reminded him of my earlier request. I just wanted to know if the information was genuine. To me, that would be payment enough. The rest of 1998 went by quickly. The national political stage was being set. It looked like George W. Bush was seeking to secure the nomination to run against Al Gore. On the 5th of July, 1999, my home phone rang. Joan answered it and said, "True, it's for you." As I answered it, a very polite masculine voice on the other end said, "Hello, True Aught. Do you have a moment to speak? This is John Kennedy calling." I immediately asked him to hold while I went to the privacy of my home office to take the call. After a few minutes of small talk, he told me, "Well, I understand you want to know what I think of your file. I want you to know that I've spent over six figures in private investigators to verify its contents. I can say to you without hesitation that its contents are indeed factual. As a matter of fact, because of this file, a federal grand jury will be convening within the next few weeks. It is my opinion, as well as my attorney's, that this federal grand jury will pass down an indictment against George Herbert Walker Bush for conspiracy to commit murder against my father and will also indict others as the evidence unfolds. If George W. thinks he can run for dog catcher after this grand jury convenes and his father is indicted, he is sorely mistaken." And so this whole idea that George Bush was actually involved in the JFK assassination is not a new idea. This guy, John Hankey, who this True Out reached out to and was telling him this story, this guy, John Hankey, dives into this pretty heavily in some of his documentary films. And if you just kind of do some searching around, you can find a number of articles that talk about George H.W. Bush's links to the Kennedy assassination, and a lot of this whole notion that George Bush might have been involved. It stems from this memo here that was from J. Edgar Hoover, and it was about. It was sent just right after the JFK assassination, and it had to do with a Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency. And this has always kind of like puzzled people because George Bush didn't officially work for the CIA at this time. He didn't officially work for the CIA for another decade. So there was like no record or anything like that of him working for the CIA when the Kennedy assassination happened. And then this memo surfaced. J. Edgar Hoover just says that this Mr. George Bush of the CIA sent out or placed a phone call, I think it was, that this person, James Parrott, had been talking about killing the president and he'd overheard it. And so he was relaying that information. There's this photo, some people claim this shows George Bush at Dealey Plaza right outside the Texas School Book Depository. Right after JFK was killed. Again, unfortunately, it's a pretty blurry photo, so it's difficult to really tell too much about this person's facial features. But some people do claim that this does show George Bush. It's interesting to me how just right after the Kennedy assassination, George Bush's career just freaking took off like a rocket because he wasn't involved in politics in 1963. Really. Nobody knew who the hell he was. He was just this Texas oil guy who ran this company called Zapata Oil. And then just right after the Kennedy assassination, just a few short years, he was elected to the House of Representatives. George Bush was. Then right after that, just 3-4 years later, he became the United States ambassador to the United Nations. Only did that for less than 2 years. Then he became the chair of the Republican National Committee, and then he became the director of the CIA. And then after that, he became vice president under Ronald Reagan. You just look at his career path here to go from not even being involved in politics to, in less than 10 years, being the director of the CIA. I mean, that's a absolutely meteoric rise to power. And you do wonder if this was sort of like a payoff or some sort of reward for being involved in the Kennedy assassination. It has long been rumored that this oil business that George Bush ran, Zapata Oil, before he became involved in politics, it's long been rumored that it was kind of just almost more of like a cover for CIA activity or some other mysterious things that he was up to. So there's not like anything too compelling linking George Bush to the JFK assassination, but there are kind of some questions. And what this true audit is claiming is that the Gemstone file that he found or that he became in possession of did have like conclusive evidence that linked George Bush to this. So this Truott continues about his discussion he was having with John F. Kennedy Jr. over the phone. Truott says, "I was thrilled yet deeply saddened by John's disclosures to me. I asked him how he felt about what he was about to do. Did he understand that it would shake American politics, especially the Republican Party, to its very foundation? He replied, 'Yes, I do realize the gravity of this story and my accusations, but the guilty must be brought to justice.' I pressed, 'But Mr. Kennedy, how do you feel?' The phone went silent for a moment or two. Then John replied, 'I feel like a mighty weight has been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I feel empowered. I feel my father's spirit beside me on this, and finally, I can exorcise a few demons from my life.' He was definitely emotional and very close to tears. I knew that I was. I was a part of American history. I had helped a brother search for truth. I warned him to be careful that such actions were potentially very dangerous. He agreed and said that he was taking every precaution. Then in a quiet voice, he asked me for my banking information. He wished to wire me $50,000 to my account. I told him thanks but no thanks. Give it to charity, I said. I don't think it's right to accept money for such terrible information. I am totally satisfied knowing that the file went to the very person that needed it the very most. Above all, John, please be careful." A little over 2 weeks later, on July 16th, 1999, John Kennedy Jr., along with his wife and her sister, were killed in a plane crash en route to Hyannisport for a family wedding. My new friend was gone, and the guilty involved in both murders have still not been punished. I know the truth, however. There is no doubt whatsoever why John was killed. It was not an accident. And now we get into the point where these two guys start exchanging emails back and forth and kind of discussing where to go from here. Again, this guy Truott reached out to this filmmaker, John Hankey, who'd already done a number of films about the JFK assassination, told him this story about inheriting this Gemstone file and apparently giving it to JFK Jr. And so these two guys kind of start discussing back and forth where to go from here. So John Hankey wrote an email. He said, "Hey, True, I thought I'd share a couple thoughts that wandered through my mind. There was never another issue of George. That makes no sense from any point of view. When one issue is on the newsstands, the next three are already in the works. A tribute issue would have sold millions of copies. Yours is the only plausible explanation for this anomaly. Number two, Richard Blow says the day he died, JFK Jr. told his staff in a meeting, 'As long as I'm alive, you'll have a job at George Magazine.' That's an extraordinary statement. What could have possibly moved him to make such a commitment? Again, yours is the only possible explanation. He set the dangers of the task before them and offered to let anyone to leave who wanted to, and then was utterly committed to those who stayed. So I believe your story. I'd like to share it with other people. I'd like to invite you to tell me what you'd like me not to say, John." And Truott replied, he said, "As far as sharing my story, there are no limits except the truth. Just tell it like it is." And then John Hankey said, "The truth is often incredible, important truth almost always so. So I have to find corroboration to make the story credible. I told my closest friend, he's puzzled and incredulous like this. If the story is true, where's the file? I didn't have a good answer for that." And Truott replied, "The original file went down with John's plane. At least that's what I was told. The copied file sent to my DC attorney is simply not available. My immediate family is at risk, and giving it to others would violate the detente agreement. Columnist Jack Anderson evidently saw the file 6 or 7 years ago, and even he refused to open Pandora's box. Best to let sleeping dogs lie. The truth is that the crime cartel running this country is simply too big and powerful for the common man to fight. I reiterate what I told you on the phone. You figured it out. The Gemstone file only gives complete confirmation to what you produced." And then John Hankey says, "I'm grateful that you called me at all, but it sounds like I'm better off to shut my mouth about what you've told me since, like many true stories, it's so incredible and the other evidence is there in plain sight anyway. But just looking at the face across me from at the table, As I'm telling the story, to finish with, "Oh yeah, the file's not available," just rips the carpet out from under any credibility the story had. Oh well, the story stands on the other evidence. Since you brought it up, I'm very interested to know, please, who told you the original file went down in the plane? I assume that the original file was just photocopies of the documents in any case. Were there original documents in the file? And then Truott replied, yes, the original file was copies of documents, bank statements, travel vouchers, canceled checks, letters from Bush on Zapata letterheads, etc. The mob had targeted Cuba as their gaming mecca following the Bay of Pigs debacle, and then they moved with Plan B, Las Vegas. So that's interesting in light of the Howard Hughes moving to Las Vegas information. It was one of the George office staff who told me that the file went down with John. Don't remember if it was Richard or someone else, only they were damned nervous. Here's the kicker, even with the file, John Jr. couldn't get it done. What makes you think you or I could do any better? And then John Hankey responds, hey, True, I appreciate your willingness to correspond on this difficult stuff. You raised a couple of issues. I'm not trying to do better than John. I'm not him. I'm not in the same game or in the same league. I'm trying to do the best I know how, which, among other things, means telling the story as clearly and persuasively as I can. I think your part of the story is powerful, important, and fascinating. But my experience in telling it to others is that without the file, it is not credible. Another issue, it seems to me, is that if John died for trying to tell that story, to avenge his death, I'd like to give the fullest meaning to his life. That means presenting the file. A separate issue altogether is that I had no idea you had spoken to anyone from George after the plane went down. I would very much like to know about that conversation. Who called who? Why? How long after the plane crashed? To say the file went down with John seems like an obvious euphemism. How could they not have multiple copies? That is, how could several investigators and an entire magazine staff be working on it without each having copies of the material they were investigating? And then Truott replied, in answer to your question, it was about a week after John's plane went down. I had received about 8 calls from major publication, U.S. News and World Report, Time, Wall Street Journal, etc., asking about reports that I had provided a file to John. Did I, and what did it contain? I denied all and made no comment. It was at this time that George Magazine called me as well. I think it was the editor Richard, though I'm not completely certain. He told me the story was dead and the magazine was folding. He also told me that all evidence went with John and that their offices had been burgled. You're right, of course. It doesn't make any sense that there were not any backup files. Apparently, they were taken as well. Again, this was a time of extreme concern for me and my family, and I don't remember a lot of the specific details clearly. I don't mind telling you that I indeed feared for my life for at least a month. Please understand that I don't believe I am paranoid, but when one verifies that one's phones have indeed been tapped, it makes one a bit concerned. In addition to the murder of John Sr., keep in mind that this file also contained evidence concerning CIA orders for contract murders for witnesses of the event. There were over 10 collateral assassinations, one of which was the Dallas PD detective that was the focus of the DVD I sent you, Two Men in Dallas. The cabal in charge of this nation is so massive and powerful that none dare attempt to expose it. As my DC attorney has counseled me, the best we can hope for is a sort of detente, a live and let live attitude. I don't like it, but it is the reality of life at this time. The cabal is composed of powerful Jewish banking families with Mormon, Jesuit, and Freemason allies. My attorney has flat out told me that publicizing the file will greatly shift the balance of detente, and more innocents will die. In short, the cabal doesn't give a damn if we know, only if we attempt to do something meaningful about it. All my best to you, my friend. Keep searching for the truth. True art. And unfortunately, that is the end of their email exchange and the end of the article. So it's a little anticlimactic. There's no massive revelation or no huge thing that came out of this. So definitely a little anticlimactic, but there's still a lot going on here in regard to this article and these, emails and this supposed file that existed. The first thing is the JFK Jr.'s death is very, very mysterious. This John Hankey did end up making a video or making a movie about the mystery surrounding John Kennedy Jr.'s death and the mystery of the plane crash. You can find that on YouTube. It's a really good video to watch. Another really interesting thing about this article and just about George Magazine in general, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, but the name of George Magazine has always been a bit of a mystery, kind of like a real strange thing. because it was a political magazine. Could have named it anything, but for whatever reason, JFK Jr. decided to name it George Magazine. It's such an odd name. And if you dig around a little bit, there's kind of conflicting stories about where this name for his magazine actually came from. One person said it came from this guy, Lou Alder, who was a music producer. He's the guy who always sits courtside at Lakers games with Jack Nicholson. Another other claim that it was named after George Washington. But one of the more intriguing explanations was that JFK Jr. did in fact know, or did in fact believe, that George Bush was responsible or played a huge role in his father's death, and that he had named this magazine George Magazine because his plan all along was to release the magazine, build up the circulation, build up the readership, and then drop a freaking nuclear bomb on everyone by revealing that George Bush was involved in his father's death, and saying that that's why he named the magazine George Magazine. So that's a really intriguing, really amazing potential explanation for why he named the magazine George Magazine. Again, that's just kind of speculation, but it does kind of make a little sense. I mean, it is this naming your political magazine George Magazine just is such a strange name, such an odd name. Another thing I really find interesting is, of course, that these files that this true aught supposedly inherited were referred to as the Gemstone Files. And it seems like this was really more than just the Gemstone file that I covered in the video I made. Because he talks in some of his emails about how there was really concrete, definitive evidence, like travel vouchers, receipts, letters that were written on like CIA and Zapata oil letterheads. So it sounds like this file was really, really extensive and was really compelling evidence that pointed to George Bush or whoever was involved, like being involved. I also find it really interesting that Hank Greenspun just happened to be mentioned in this, supposed file that existed, because Hank Greenspun is just a really random kind of guy. Like 90% of the population probably has no idea who Hank Greenspun even is, even though he was, I believe, extremely, extremely powerful. Obviously, he had this, Howard Hughes file that apparently was so explosive and so massive in whatever it revealed that he said he would go to the can for life rather than surrender the document. And then he, obviously played a huge role in the whole Howard Hughes thing when he moved to Las Vegas. So it's definitely really intriguing that, Hank Greenspun is not only mentioned, but, you do wonder if, well, maybe this file that Truott got a hold of and inherited from his client, maybe this was this Howard Hughes file that Hank Greenspun talked about when he testified during the Watergate hearings. And then lastly, the whole Mormon connection is really interesting too. And, the fact that Hank Greenspun is mentioned and the Gemstone File is mentioned and this Truott, at one time was involved in the Mormon church, I think lends some credibility to what he's saying. Again, this really mysterious group who not a lot is known about. The Mormon Mafia came in and just controlled this absolutely massive Howard Hughes empire, bought up basically all of Las Vegas, and really made serious moves with all this money that Howard Hughes, quote unquote, had. And so just kind of the Mormon connection to this story as well kind of lends it some credibility. I wish there was some sort of massive revelation that at the end of this, or something that wasn't so anticlimactic as just the two guys deciding, well, we don't have the file. Truott did mention that he was told that the George Magazine offices had been broken into as well, and that the copies of the file had been stolen, which is kind of interesting. But unfortunately, it's, there's no definitive proof that this did exist, although I think there's a lot of things that kind of lend some credibility to what he's saying. But I do think it's a really, interesting little article and a really interesting topic to discuss, and just kind of wanted to make a quick video about this just because it kind of relates to the Gemstone File and the Howard Hughes disappearance, which I did recent videos on. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you soon with another one.